Harrison Sterling didn't look at the waitress's face. He looked at her name tag first, Sarah, then at her shoes. Scuffed. The kind worn by people who stood all day and owned nothing worth polishing. A faint sneer tugged at the corner of his mouth, subtle but deliberate. To Harrison, hierarchy was a language and he spoke it fluently. The restaurant shimmered with wealth. Crystal glasses caught the light. Linen so white it felt aggressive. Conversations floated through the air in low, confident murmurs. Investments, villas, schools that didn't list tuition publicly. This was Harrison's arena. He straightened slightly in his chair, spreading his presence, reminding the room who he was without saying a word. Sarah stood patiently at the table, menu balanced in one hand, posture perfect. She had learned long ago that stillness was safer than reaction. Harrison finally spoke, but not to her. "Unacceptable," he muttered, inspecting the wine glass as if it had personally offended him. Sarah leaned in just enough to be professional. "May I replace that for you, sir?" That was when he smiled. Not warmly. Not kindly. Strategically. He switched languages mid-sentence, the way some men switch weapons. The French he used wasn't conversational. It wasn't tourist French. It was ornate, aristocratic, deliberately outdated, the kind of language pulled from salons, not streets. A dialect designed not to communicate, but to dominate. He spoke quickly, theatrically, his accent exaggerated just enough to signal effort. Heads at nearby tables turned. This wasn't an order. It was a performance. He let the words spill out in a smooth, condescending stream, laced with implication and mockery. He didn't pause to see if she understood. He didn't need to. The point wasn't comprehension, it was exposure. Language, to Harrison Sterling, was power. And power only mattered when someone else lacked it. He leaned back in his chair, watching her now. Waiting. Waiting for the confusion. Waiting for the apology. Waiting for the small, embarrassed smile and the inevitable, "I'm sorry, sir, I don't understand." Because that moment, that quiet collapse, that was the reward. Around them, the air tightened. His date shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. The manager glanced over from across the room, already calculating risk. This was not the first time Harrison Sterling had turned a meal into a lesson. Sarah didn't respond. Not immediately. She stood there, eyes lowered, hands still, absorbing the words without a flicker of expression. To Harrison, the silence confirmed everything he believed. He smirked, satisfied, already tasting victory. In his world, people like her existed to be corrected. What Harrison Sterling didn't know, what he couldn't see past the apron and the worn shoes, was that the woman standing in front of him had spent years mastering the very dialect he was using to humiliate her. And that in a few moments, she would speak a single sentence so precise, so devastating, that it wouldn't just embarrass him at a table. It would begin the complete dismantling of his life. Sarah Bennett had been on her feet for 9 hours. By the time the clock crept past 8, the dull ache in her left arch had turned sharp, like a nail being pressed deeper with every step. She shifted her weight subtly as she moved between tables, careful not to limp. Limping invited comments. Comments invited attention. And attention was the last thing she could afford tonight. Her black slacks were a size too big, held up by a small safety pin hidden beneath her apron. The pin dug into her waist every time she bent down, but she barely noticed anymore. Pain had become background noise. Like the clink of silverware. Like the low hum of expensive conversations drifting over her head. To the patrons of Lorany, Sarah was barely visible. She was the hand that refilled the wineglass. The voice that recited specials she would never taste. The shadow that absorbed complaints and moved on. No one saw the faint dark circles under her eyes, carefully concealed with drugstore concealer. No one noticed the way her shoulders tensed when she stood still for too long, or how she exhaled slowly whenever she reached the service station, as if bracing herself for another round. Table 4 needs water. Table 7 wants to send the sea bass back, the manager hissed as she passed. Move, Bennett. Move. On it, Sarah replied softly, already moving. Her shoes, cheap, generic non-slips from a discount store in Queens, were beginning to fall apart at the seams. The soles were thinning. The cushioning was gone. Every step felt like concrete biting back. She made a mental note to tape them when she got home. Rent was due Tuesday. Her father's physical therapy bill was due Friday. There was no room for mistakes. Sarah was 26 years old, and to everyone in that room, she was nothing more than a uniform. Black and white. Replaceable. Temporary. They didn't know that 3 years earlier, she had been living in Paris. They didn't know that she had once walked cobblestone streets with books tucked under her arm, arguing about syntax and philosophy in quiet cafes. They didn't know she had been a doctoral candidate in comparative linguistics, one of the youngest in her program, praised for her precision and clarity of thought. They didn't know any of that. All they saw was a waitress. The transformation had happened fast. Too fast to grieve properly. One phone call. One accident. One word that changed everything. Stroke. Her father, strong, steady, a man of few words even before he lost them, had collapsed on a job site back home in Ohio. The medical bills had arrived before the shock wore off. Savings disappeared. Scholarships didn't pay hospital invoices. Intelligence didn't negotiate insurance. So Sarah had left Paris overnight. She traded lecture halls for long shifts, libraries for trays. The future she had built with careful discipline was folded away like a coat she could no longer afford to wear. And still, she endured. Because endurance was quieter than despair. As she moved through the dining room, she kept her face composed, her expression neutral but pleasant. It was a mask she wore instinctively now, like armor. Polite. Unremarkable. People were kinder when they didn't have to acknowledge your humanity. She paused briefly at the service station, gripping the counter until the trembling in her hands passed. Just a moment. Just enough to breathe. Then she straightened and turned back toward the floor. That was when she saw him. Harrison Sterling had just been seated at the best table in the restaurant, the one by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city lights. He sat like he owned the space, legs spread slightly, jacket draped just so. His presence bent the air around him. Sarah didn't know his face yet, but she knew his type. She smoothed her apron, rolled her shoulders back, and took a quiet breath. Get through the shift, she told herself. Pay the rent. Pay the bills. Go home. She approached the table with practiced calm. Good evening, she said, her voice even, warm but restrained. Welcome to Lorny. My name is Sarah, and I'll be taking care of you tonight. Harrison didn't look up. He was examining the silverware, turning a fork in the light as if searching for flaws. Sparkling water, he said flatly. And bring the reserve wine list. Not the one you give tourists. Of course, sir, Sarah replied without hesitation. She glanced toward his date, who offered a small, apologetic smile. Still water, please, the woman said quietly. Sarah nodded. I'll be right back. As she turned to leave, Harrison finally looked at her. Not her face. Her shoes. His lip curled just slightly. Sarah felt the heat rise in her neck, but she kept walking. She had learned the hardest lesson of survival early on. Silence wasn't weakness. It was restraint. And sometimes, restraint was the only thing keeping a person standing. Harrison Sterling had the kind of confidence that didn't come from peace. It came from power. He was tall, sharply dressed, and perfectly groomed, wearing a navy bespoke suit that fit just tight enough to advertise the hours he spent at a private gym. Everything about him was calculated. The watch. The posture. The way he sat down first, without waiting for his date, claiming space as if it were currency. This was a man who believed the world responded to pressure. Harrison wasn't old money. He was something louder. Something newer. A hedge fund manager who had made headlines not for innovation, but for aggression. Hostile takeovers. Public feuds. Companies gutted and sold off like trophies. Money had come fast, and with it, the certainty that it made him untouchable. He scanned the room the way a general surveys a battlefield, not looking for beauty, but for witnesses. He wanted to be seen here. He wanted people to notice him at the best table, with the best view, ordering the most expensive wine. Validation, to him, was oxygen. His date sat across from him, stunning in a deep red dress that caught the warm glow of the restaurant lighting. But her body language told a different story. Her shoulders were slightly hunched. Her arms crossed loosely, like a shield she didn't realize she was holding. She smiled when required, laughed when prompted, but her eyes kept drifting away. Sarah noticed this immediately. Years of service had trained her to read people the way others read menus. She saw the tension in the woman's jaw, the way she flinched almost imperceptibly when Harrison snapped his fingers for attention. The dynamic was clear. Harrison spoke. Everyone else adjusted. When Sarah returned with the water and wine list, Harrison didn't acknowledge her presence. He addressed the table. The glass. The air. "Make sure the glass is clean this time," he said, loud enough for nearby diners to hear. "Last place I went to couldn't even manage that. Hard to get competent staff these days, isn't it?" There was the first jab. Not loud. Not explosive. Just sharp enough to draw blood without consequence. Sarah kept her expression neutral. "I'll personally inspect it for you, sir." "You do that," he replied, waving her away as if dismissing a fly. He leaned toward his date, lowering his voice just enough to make it feel private while still being heard. "You have to be firm with people like this. Otherwise, they walk all over you. It's a power dynamic." The woman nodded faintly, though her discomfort was obvious now. She stared into her water glass like it might offer an exit. Sarah turned away, her jaw tight. She had dealt with difficult customers before. Drunks. Shouters. Entitled diners who confused payment with ownership. But Harrison Sterling was different. There was a predatory boredom behind his eyes. Men like Harrison didn't lash out because they were angry. They did it because they were entertained. Because they enjoyed testing how far they could push before someone broke. At the bar, Tonia leaned over, lowering her voice. "That's Sterling," she muttered. 5% tipper. Tried to get the valet fired last time because it was raining." Sarah nodded once. "I can handle him." But even as she said it, something coiled tightly in her stomach. Across the room, the manager, Charles Henderson, hovered like a nervous satellite. He had noticed Harrison the moment he walked in. Big spender. Big ego. Big risk. Henderson believed in one rule above all others: protect the revenue. He watched Harrison carefully, already preparing himself to apologize on behalf of the restaurant if needed. To bend. To sacrifice. When Sarah passed him, he leaned in close. "That's a VIP, he hissed. "Table 1. Best view. Don't mess this up." "Yes, Charles," she said quietly, as if she needed the reminder. She approached the table again with the appetizers, balancing the tray with practiced ease despite the ache in her spine. She placed the plates carefully, announced the dishes, and reached for the wine. Harrison stopped her mid-pour. He swirled the glass dramatically, sniffing it like a performance piece. "It's corked," he announced. The restaurant seemed to hold its breath. Sarah paused. She knew the wine. She had opened it herself. Checked the cork. Smelled it. It was flawless. "I'm sorry, sir," she said calmly. "I opened it moments ago. It may just need a bit of air." Harrison's hands slammed onto the table. Silverware rattled. A few heads turned. "Are you arguing with me?" he snapped, his voice rising. "Do you know how much wine I buy? I don't need a waitress with, what is that, a queen's accent, lecturing me about Bordeaux." This wasn't about wine anymore. It was about dominance. Sarah felt the familiar heat in her chest, the instinct to disappear, to de-escalate. "I'll fetch the sommelier," she said tightly. "No," Harrison smiled, thin and cruel. "Don't bother. He's busy with important tables." He leaned back, pleased with himself. "Bring me the menu again. I've lost my appetite." Sarah nodded, picked up the plates, and walked away. She didn't rush. But inside, she knew something had shifted. And when men like Harrison Sterling get bored, they don't leave. They escalate. Harrison Sterling leaned forward, a sly smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. The restaurant's soft lighting hit his perfectly tailored suit, highlighting the new money shine he always relied on to intimidate. His gaze fell on Sarah Bennett, the waitress, and in an instant, the air shifted. "Ah, mademoiselle," he began, his voice smooth, condescending, the kind that demanded attention. "You must forgive my curiosity. But tell me, Do you even understand the subtleties of what I am about to say? Sarah kept her expression neutral, her hands steady as she carried the tray with his wine. She had learned a long time ago that arrogance liked to test boundaries. That smirk of his, it had happened countless times before. Yet something in her chest tightened, a flicker of anticipation. "Jamie demand," Harrison continued, switching fluidly into a complex, archaic dialect of French one few could claim to understand. Every word he chose was calculated, each phrase a subtle barb designed to humiliate. It was the language of old aristocracy, a weapon he wielded like a sword. He watched her closely, waiting for hesitation, waiting for confusion to cross her face. The patrons nearby chuckled softly, recognizing the performance. This was a show to them, a spectacle of wealth over service. They leaned in slightly, curious, anticipating the predictable falter. A young woman, alone and overworked, surely she couldn't keep up. Harrison's tone sharpened, his words flowing faster now, more intricate, more cutting. "Vous avez été for me, j'imagine, à servir, mais la satellite de la langue c'est autre chose. Comprenez-vous ce que je dis, ou essayez de vos capacités?" The words hung in the air. For anyone unfamiliar with the dialect, they were just elegant sounds. But for those who could understand, well, there was a razor edge hidden in the rhythm. Sarah's lips pressed together. Inside, her mind raced, parsing each sentence, each nuance. Every insult, every suggestion that she was beneath him, it landed exactly where he intended. The trap was set, and yet, she felt no panic. Not yet. Harrison leaned back, smiling. He had done this before. This was his arena. He was the predator, circling, confident. The crowd of diners, the restaurant staff, even his date, Jessica, watched, captivated by the unfolding scene. She was meant to falter, and the anticipation of her failure fed his ego. And yet, in the silence of her composure, Sarah's own calculation began. She measured every word he had thrown, every grammatical flourish meant to dazzle, every obscure reference meant to assert superiority. The very dialect he had chosen, so deliberately rarefied, so designed to belittle, was one she had studied for years. Years. Every conjugation, every idiom, every archaic nuance had been drilled into her during her time in Paris. The irony did not escape her. The weapon he wielded with such confidence was one she could wield even more precisely. Harrison, unaware of the depth of her knowledge, continued, his voice taking on the rhythm of triumph. "Ah, vous êtes silencieuse, un bon signe, sans doute, ou you peut être simplement l'inaptitude. Comment savoir?" He glanced around, subtly gesturing, drawing the eyes of everyone nearby. His smirk widened. This, he believed, was the moment of public annihilation. Sarah took a slow, steadying breath. She could feel the room's attention, the weight of expectation, the quiet amusement of those who assumed she would fail. And then, in that pause, she realized the power she held, not in wealth, not in arrogance, not in performative intimidation, but in knowledge, in understanding, in calm. Harrison had escalated. He had laid his trap. But he didn't know the trap was empty. The waiter's tray in her hands was steady. Her heart beat fast, adrenaline sharpening her focus, but her expression remained calm. She knew exactly what to do. She would not shout. She would not stumble. Every word, every syllable would land with precision. And the beauty of it? No one could see the shift yet. Only she knew. Only she understood. Harrison Sterling, for all his bluster, had built his own cage, and she held the key. Around them, the room continued to hum softly. Patrons whispered, servers moved discreetly, the subtle clinking of glasses punctuated the tension. Harrison's smirk remained, but it was fragile now, built on assumptions that were about to collapse. Sarah's thoughts were quiet, controlled. He thinks language is power, she reflected. And in his arrogance, he's right, if you don't know how to use it. But I do. Always have. And in that quiet understanding, in that tiny, invisible shift, the stage was set. The public was watching, yes, but the true reckoning was private. Harrison had underestimated her. And that mistake would be catastrophic. Sarah paused. She didn't reach for a notepad. She didn't fumble for a manager. She simply lifted her chin, squared her shoulders, and met Harrison Sterling's gaze. The silence at the table stretched, long and heavy, like the pause before a storm. Harrison leaned back slightly, smug, expecting confusion. A stammer. The blank, terrified look of someone trying, and failing, to keep up. He waited. She didn't blink. She didn't stammer. Then she spoke. Monsieur Sterling. Her voice carried effortlessly, rich and precise, each word deliberate. It wasn't the polite monotone of a waitress. This was the voice of someone who had argued in lecture halls, debated in Parisian cafes, defended dissertations. It was polished, resonant, sharp, but calm. You are attempting the imperfect subjunctive to impress me, she said, enunciating every syllable. A clever choice, yet I would advise reviewing your conjugations. As for the duck, your metaphor comparing its skin to glass, it is rather clumsy. Such imagery is generally reserved for mediocre 19th-century poetry. Harrison froze. The fork he had been twirling hovered midair, motionless. His mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. He understood perhaps half the words, but the tone, the sheer, undeniable authority behind them, was universal. It cut through the room like a blade. Sarah wasn't finished. She shifted her gaze to the wine he had dismissed so rudely. Her eyes softened slightly, but there was no forgiveness there, only clarity. Quant à votre vin, she continued, slowing just enough, as if explaining to a child, it is not vinegar. This is a 2015 Chat Margaux. The acidity you detect is a signature of young tannins. Appreciating them requires an educated palate. If that is too complex, I would be delighted to provide a sweet Merlot, something simpler, to suit your taste. The room went still. Dead still. Every nearby diner froze mid-chew. Even the clinking of a fork against a plate seemed loud, intrusive. The bartender stopped polishing a glass. The floor manager, Charles Henderson, who usually hovered like a hawk, stopped mid-step. The low hum of conversation faded into a tense, anticipatory silence. Harrison's face drained of color, then flushed crimson. The power dynamic had flipped in the blink of an eye. He had come to dominate, to belittle, to humiliate, and now he was the one exposed. He opened his mouth, trying to regain control, to speak, to retort, but the French words wouldn't come. Every syllable he had practiced, every smirk and sneer intended to assert superiority, fell flat. His mind scrambled. He had underestimated her. Badly. Jessica, his date, looked up from her hands, eyes wide. Her lips parted slightly, a mixture of awe and relief crossing her face. She wasn't looking at a waitress anymore. She was witnessing a masterclass in quiet authority, in intellect wielded with precision. She was seeing a hero. Sarah took a small, deliberate step back, adjusting her posture so she stood tall over the table. There was no hurry, no panic. She had all the time in the world. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't shout. And yet the weight of her presence, the command in her tone, was undeniable. I will put in your duck, sir, she said, switching back to English effortlessly, her voice calm, professional. And I'll bring the Merlot. I think you'll find it much easier to enjoy. A small, distinct nod accompanied the words. She didn't rush. She didn't flinch. She simply turned, tray in hand, and walked away, leaving Harrison Sterling paralyzed, seated in his own humiliation. The ghost of her perfect French hung in the air, invisible but unmistakable. Behind the scenes, adrenaline coursed through her veins. Her knees felt like they might buckle, her hands shook slightly, but outwardly she was composed. This was more than a victory over one arrogant man. This was a reclamation of dignity, of self, of intellect. For a moment, the restaurant existed only in the balance of that encounter. Patrons whispered softly to each other, casting sideways glances. Even those who hadn't understood a word of French could feel it, the reversal of power, the quiet triumph of skill over arrogance. And Harrison Sterling? He sat frozen, trapped in a performance he had thought he controlled, realizing that words, the very weapon he had wielded, could also be used against him. Sarah moved past the table with the measured confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Every step echoed subtly, not in arrogance, but in authority earned. And as she reached the service corridor, the adrenaline that had held her upright finally ebbed, leaving a twinge of fear, but a victorious one. She had spoken. She had struck. And the world, just for a heartbeat, had recognized her power. Sarah stepped back from the table, her hands still trembling slightly from the rush of adrenaline that had surged through her just moments before. The heat of confrontation had passed, replaced by a hollow, dizzying calm. Her chest felt tight, her pulse a steady drum in her ears, and for the first time that night, the weight of reality pressed down on her. Harrison Sterling had frozen, stunned into silence, and for a brief second, victory had been hers. But the restaurant around her didn't pause. Waiters scurried discreetly, glasses clinked faintly in the background, and the faint murmur of diners buzzed like an electric current through the room. Her manager, a wiry man named Leonard, appeared at her side almost immediately. His face was pale, eyes darting between her and Harrison. "Sarah," he whispered urgently, "we need to talk. Now." She knew exactly what that meant. In the sterile world of fine dining, mistakes, real or perceived, were punished swiftly. And though she hadn't made one, she could feel the tension radiating from Leonard as if it were a physical force. Her stomach knotted. She had bills stacking up at home. Rent, utilities, her father's care, it all waited. One false move could unravel everything. She had fought too hard to get this far, and she wasn't about to let anyone take it away because of someone else's ego. Harrison, oblivious to the storm brewing behind him, straightened his tie, attempting to regain composure. His smirk had faltered, replaced by that familiar glint of calculation, the same one that meant he never admitted defeat easily. "Don't let this distract you," Leonard hissed, pulling her slightly to the side. "He'll try something. He always does when he's embarrassed." Sarah nodded, swallowing hard. She could feel the flush of adrenaline still coursing through her veins. Pride and fear wrestled inside her, pride for standing up, fear for what might come next. And then the subtle shift began. Patrons' eyes, once curious and entertained, started narrowing in suspicion. The elegant murmurs of the restaurant carried a new undertone, a question, a doubt. Something about the tension was unusual. Something felt off. Harrison caught the change immediately. His posture stiffened, his jaw clenched. "What is this?" he muttered under his breath, though enough that the nearest diners heard. "Why is everyone staring?" Sarah didn't answer. She couldn't. Her focus was split between maintaining composure and bracing for the fallout. Every movement, every breath was calculated. One slip, and the fragile illusion of control could shatter. Leonard leaned closer, whispering just barely above a breath. "He could accuse you of anything. Misbehavior. He'll try to turn this into a spectacle. You need to be ready." The words hit harder than she expected. Not because she doubted herself, but because the reality of her situation was sharp and unavoidable. She wasn't just facing embarrassment or a bruised ego. She was facing potential unemployment, the collapse of her carefully maintained routine, and the jeopardy of her father's medical care. The stakes were real and they were high. Harrison's smirk returned, though it was smaller, more controlled now. He leaned slightly toward Sarah, voice deceptively smooth. "You see, mademoiselle, words are powerful, yes, but so are actions. One careless step, one wrong gesture." His eyes gleamed with the threat unspoken, and the restaurant seemed to hold its collective breath. Sarah's jaw tightened. She had learned to survive on instinct and intelligence, on quiet resilience. But now, she felt the first tremor of true vulnerability. She could no longer hide behind composure alone. She had to anticipate, calculate, and prepare. Her mind raced through possibilities. What if he tried to frame her for something? What if he went further, dragged in authorities, humiliated her publicly in a way that couldn't be undone? Each scenario played out in rapid succession, each one more terrifying than the last. And yet, even as fear gripped her, something inside Sarah sparked, a quiet, defiant determination. She had faced adversity before, in ways most people could never imagine. She had survived on resilience, intellect, and the ability to stay calm when everyone else panicked. She would do it again. The restaurant remained tense, a fragile bubble of civility stretched thin over the simmering thread of chaos. Diners whispered, some sensing the drama, others oblivious, while Sarah stood in the eye of the storm. Every nerve in her body screamed caution, yet her mind was sharp, alert, waiting for the moment to act, not with brute force, but with the precision of someone who had already won the first battle. Leonard's hand rested lightly on her arm. "You're stronger than you think," he said softly. "But be careful. He's not done. Not by a long shot." Sarah took a deep breath, letting it fill her lungs and steady her nerves. Her father, her responsibilities, the life she was fighting for, it all reminded her of why she had to endure this. Fear was not weakness. It was a signal, a reminder of what was truly at stake. And now, more than ever, she needed to harness it. Harrison, meanwhile, had retreated slightly, scanning the room like a cornered predator. He had underestimated the consequences of his arrogance, and the first cracks were starting to show. But he would not stop. Not yet. And Sarah knew, with a chilling certainty, that the next move would define everything: her career, her dignity, and perhaps even her father's future. One wrong step could cost her everything, yet one right move could turn the entire night on its head. The air between them pulsed with tension, thick enough to cut with a knife. The restaurant, filled with muted whispers and quiet clinks of cutlery, felt suspended in time. Every eye, every heartbeat, every pause mattered. Sarah closed her eyes briefly, grounding herself. Fear was real, but so was her resolve. She would survive this, she promised herself. She would endure the storm Harrison had stirred, and when the moment came, she would strike, not out of anger, but with the precision of someone who had already seen the path to victory. And so, in that quiet, charged moment, the scene was set. Fear lingered, yes, but so did the unmistakable edge of determination. Sarah Bennett was no longer just the invisible waitress. She was a force waiting for the right moment to act. The restaurant had barely settled from the shock of Sarah's calm, precise response in Parisian French when Harrison Sterling's eyes narrowed, the storm behind them dark and deliberate. His ego, bruised by her flawless correction, had no room for humiliation, at least, not without retaliation. He leaned slightly forward, voice raised just enough for the nearest tables to catch the edge of it. "Mademoiselle Bennett," he said, every syllable sharp and deliberate, "I believe you've taken something of mine." The words were simple, yet the weight behind them was like a hammer striking glass. Silence rippled across the restaurant, punctuated only by the faint clatter of a dropped fork somewhere near the corner. Patrons froze mid-bite, eyes darting between Sarah and Harrison. The accusation hung in the air like smoke, visible, heavy, and impossible to ignore. Sarah's first instinct was disbelief. She had faced rudeness, condescension, and even cruelty before, but this was new, a direct threat to her integrity. She opened her mouth to protest, but the fear in the room was palpable, almost tangible. Leonard's hand gripped her arm, tight and urgent, as if to anchor her in the moment before she reacted. "Your credit card," Harrison continued, voice smooth but venomous, "was found missing after you cleared my table. I believe it's in your possession." Sarah's stomach dropped. She had no card, no theft, nothing that could even remotely justify this. But in that room, with all eyes on her, perception was everything. One wrong movement, one misstep, and the narrative could twist into reality for everyone watching. Harrison's gaze was cold, predatory, a shark circling in the shallow water of her vulnerability. His arrogance had shifted now, morphing into aggression. This wasn't about pride anymore, this was about power. And he was willing to bend facts, intimidate witnesses, and use every lever of influence he possessed to make sure she fell. The diners whispered among themselves, confusion and curiosity mixing in uneven waves. Some looked appalled at the accusation, others seemed to silently question, could she really have done it? That doubt, however unfair, was the kind Harrison had been cultivating all evening, planting seeds of suspicion, nudging reality toward his own narrative. Leonard leaned closer to Sarah, voice barely audible over the rising murmurs. Stay calm. Don't argue. Whatever happens, don't make it worse. Sarah nodded, swallowing the panic that threatened to rise in her throat. Every instinct screamed for her to shout, to defend herself loudly, but she knew, just as she had known moments ago, that the key to survival wasn't noise. It was patience, precision, and timing. Harrison didn't stop. He gestured slightly toward the front of the restaurant, voice carrying. If necessary, I'll involve the authorities. Surely theft is a serious matter. No one here would want that on their conscience. The threat was thinly veiled, yet unmistakable. Sarah could feel the room shrinking around her, every pair of eyes a silent jury, judging her before she even spoke. The fear was not only hers. She could see Leonard's tension, the subtle tightening of the diner's lips, the polite but cautious movements of waitstaff. And still, she remained silent, letting the words hang. She didn't panic. She didn't flinch. Inside, adrenaline roared, but she channeled it into sharp awareness. The position of Harrison's hands, the tilt of his head, the subtle cues of his growing frustration. He wanted a reaction. He wanted a crack. But she would not give him that. Harrison's voice rose another notch, louder this time, ensuring every corner of the restaurant heard. This is serious. You can't just... He faltered slightly, almost imperceptibly, as if the disbelief around him was starting to undermine his own conviction. And then it happened. A subtle shift in the atmosphere. Patrons who had been on the fence, quiet observers who had merely entertained the spectacle, now began exchanging glances of disbelief. A few murmured, their voices laced with doubt, questioning Harrison's claim. Even Leonard's posture shifted from anxious defense to quiet anticipation, like someone sensing the tides could finally turn. Sarah's heart hammered, but a clarity settled over her. She could feel the momentum tilting slightly, the energy of the room beginning to sense the absurdity of the accusation. She had endured humiliation, manipulation, and threat, but this was a test she could not only survive, she could use. Harrison, sensing hesitation, leaned forward again, sharper this time. I've had enough of this nonsense, he said, his voice firm but strained. I want that card. Now. It was the moment Sarah had been preparing for. Calmly, deliberately, she met his gaze, not with anger, not with fear, but with the quiet, undeniable certainty of someone who knew the truth. Every observer could see it. She was unshakable. And in that small, tense pause, the scene held, a fragile balance between accusation and revelation, threat and justice. Harrison's power, once absolute, now seemed tentative, as if the air itself had started to turn against him. Fear had spread, yes, but it was no longer hers alone. Doubt had crept in, infecting Harrison's audience and planting seeds that would soon blossom into reckoning. Sarah breathed quietly, steadying herself, feeling the pulse of control return, not with force, but with the quiet, unwavering presence of truth. Harrison had escalated, threatened, and tried to dominate, but he hadn't counted on her resilience, on her ability to let the right moment, the perfect timing, shift the entire narrative. And in that silence, that careful pause, it was clear. This wasn't over, but the first cracks had appeared. Harrison's false accusation was a gamble, and Sarah, patient and unyielding, had begun to tip the scales in her favor. The tension in the restaurant had become almost unbearable. Harrison Sterling's accusation of theft still hung in the air like a dense fog, thick and suffocating. Patrons whispered in clusters, some leaning forward in curiosity, others leaning back in silent discomfort. All eyes were on Sarah, the woman who had just endured public humiliation and now faced a false accusation that threatened everything she had fought for. Her hands clenched lightly at her sides, nails biting into her palms. Her chest heaved, not from exertion but from adrenaline and the need to stay composed. One wrong move, one ill-chosen word, and her entire world, her job, her father's care, her dignity, could collapse in an instant. Harrison, sensing her vulnerability, smiled thinly, savoring the moment as if victory were already his. But then, a new presence shifted the atmosphere, a quiet authority that seemed to ripple through the restaurant unnoticed at first. The older man, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that whispered wealth without screaming it, rose from a corner table near the back. He was calm, unassuming, yet every step he took carried weight, the kind that made people instinctively straighten, even just a little. "Harrison Sterling," the man said, his voice steady, smooth, carrying authority without the need to shout. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding." The name hit Harrison like a physical blow. He froze mid-step, the aggressive posture faltering slightly. "And who?" he began, but the man held up a single finger, silent but commanding. The words were not just words, they were a signal. Stop, listen, and know your place. The room seemed to hold its breath. Diners leaned forward, sensing a shift in power they could feel but not yet understand. Sarah felt it too, a sudden, almost tangible relief. It was as if the air itself had changed, carrying the promise that she might not face this ordeal alone. The older man approached, glancing briefly at Sarah with a nod of reassurance. "The card in question," he said calmly, "was never missing. In fact, it was in Mr. Sterling's pocket the entire time." A collective murmur rippled through the restaurant. Eyes widened. Heads turned toward Harrison, who now looked less like the predator he had been moments ago and more like a man caught off guard, unprepared for an opponent he hadn't anticipated. Sarah's breath caught, but she remained composed, letting the revelation sink in without a word. Her mind raced, cataloging every nuance, every opportunity this moment presented. Harrison, for the first time, looked vulnerable, not physically, but in the kind of way that power can vanish in an instant. The older man turned fully toward Harrison, his gaze unwavering. "I am Lucien Valmont," he said, and the weight of his name seemed to resonate through the room. "Perhaps you've heard of me in your professional circles. I am responsible for many of the financial institutions you rely on, many of which I control." Harrison's jaw tightened. He had always believed wealth and status made him untouchable. But here, in this moment, those assumptions began to crumble. His confidence faltered as the realization set in. The man standing calmly before him could destroy more than his pride. He could dismantle everything Harrison had built, silently and efficiently. "And now," Lucien continued, directing his attention back to Sarah, "I believe the young woman here has been treated unfairly, accused of something she did not do. It is my recommendation that the matter end immediately and that she be afforded the respect she deserves." The tone was not a command. It didn't need to be. Authority like this doesn't shout. It simply exists, undeniable, unchallengeable. The room responded instinctively. Waitstaff relaxed. Patrons leaned back, some shaking their heads in disbelief. Harrison's date looked horrified, as if seeing the man she had been charmed by now being exposed for what he truly was: vulnerable, petty, and wholly outmatched. Harrison's eyes flicked between Lucien and Sarah, a flicker of panic flashing briefly. He opened his mouth, perhaps to argue, perhaps to reclaim some measure of dominance, but no words came. The words that had always been his weapons, his shield, seemed impotent against the quiet power radiating from Lucien. For Sarah, the moment was surreal. Relief surged through her, tempered by awe. Lucien had arrived, not as a savior in a dramatic display, but as a calm, precise force, the kind of ally whose presence alone could alter the trajectory of events. He didn't need to yell, threaten, or humiliate. His authority, coupled with undeniable evidence of Harrison's mistake, was enough. Harrison, meanwhile, felt the walls closing in. His reputation, carefully curated, now teetered on the brink of collapse. He had underestimated the stakes, the allies in the room, and, most critically, the intelligence and dignity of the woman he had sought to demean. Lucien paused, looking over the room, letting the weight of the revelation settle. Then, softly but firmly, he said, "Sarah, please resume your duties without further harassment. Mr. Sterling, I suggest you reconsider your actions tonight, both for your sake and for the sake of those who have invested their trust in you." Harrison swallowed hard. The room's tension had shifted entirely. Where moments ago he had dominated, now he was silent, the power entirely stripped away, replaced by exposure and accountability. Sarah exhaled quietly, almost imperceptibly. She felt a surge of gratitude, not just for Lucien, but for the fact that truth, patience, and composure could command justice without the need for rage or loud confrontation. Lucien's presence had changed everything, not with spectacle, but with precision. And for the first time that evening, Sarah allowed herself to believe that she might not just survive this ordeal, but emerge vindicated. Harrison Sterling, once untouchable, was now cornered. And Sarah, with quiet resolve and newfound support, was finally free to reclaim her dignity. The restaurant had fallen into a silence so complete it felt like the world itself was holding its breath. Harrison Sterling, once the embodiment of confidence and wealth, now looked small, cornered, and strangely human. The smug arrogance that had radiated from him moments ago was gone, replaced with something far less familiar: panic. Lucien Valmont's calm intervention had done more than just reveal the truth. It had stripped Harrison of the power he had assumed was untouchable. The credit card, the false accusation, the public performance, all of it now lay exposed as petty cruelty. And the patrons, once passive observers, were no longer willing to watch silently. Eyes followed Harrison with a mix of disbelief, judgment, and satisfaction. The whispers that had been cautious minutes before now surged into a steady hum of gossip and speculation. Harrison's date, who had earlier been a silent accomplice to his arrogance, finally spoke. Her voice, tinged with embarrassment and disgust, cut through the tension. "I can't believe you," she stammered, shaking her head. The words weren't accusatory, they were a verdict. Harrison opened his mouth, perhaps to argue, perhaps to salvage some shred of dignity, but the words died somewhere between his brain and tongue. The manager, who had been hovering anxiously by the side, now looked caught in the crossfire of judgment. His fear of Harrison was replaced by the realization that he had been complicit, silent when he should have acted. He stepped forward, awkwardly clearing his throat, but before he could speak, Lucien's sharp glance silenced him. Authority, after all, needs no repetition. Sarah stood at the center of the storm, but she was no longer just a victim. She had survived Harrison's arrogance, endured his public games, and now witnessed the unraveling of the man who had tried to destroy her with words and power. The adrenaline that had carried her through humiliation earlier was replaced by a quiet, steady confidence. She didn't need to say anything. Her presence alone radiated resilience. Harrison's breathing grew rapid. He looked around, taking in the stares, the judgment, the social consequences of his own actions. Wealth, influence, and status could buy many things, but respect was not one of them, and tonight he had lost it entirely. His carefully cultivated image, the persona that had made him feared in boardrooms and high-end restaurants alike, was now in ruins. Lucien, standing a few feet away, remained composed, almost serene. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His mere presence, and the quiet authority he exuded, emphasized the stark contrast between true power and the arrogance of someone who mistook status for dominance. Harrison's attempts to reclaim control were pitiful against such calm precision. The patrons, sensing the shift, began murmuring more openly. Some whispered about Harrison's likely financial missteps, his reputation in high society, and the consequences that would surely follow. Others offered discreet nods and smiles to Sarah, acknowledging the quiet dignity she had maintained throughout. It was the subtle recognition of triumph that spoke volumes more than any loud confrontation could have. Harrison's date finally turned and walked toward the exit, her expression one of shame and disbelief. He opened his mouth, perhaps to call her back, but no sound came. She had seen the man beneath the mask, and there was nothing left to salvage. The exit echoed like a final bell, signaling the collapse of the world Harrison had tried so hard to control. Even the staff, previously hesitant and subdued, began to exhale as if the air itself had been thick with the tension of fear and intimidation. Sarah caught a glimpse of her colleague's eyes, grateful and supportive, a quiet reminder that solidarity can be as powerful as any ally. Harrison's shoulders slumped. The arrogance, the posturing, the cruelty, it had all led him here, to a moment of utter vulnerability. For the first time in a long while, he was exposed. He was no longer the untouchable force he had believed himself to be. Every smirk, every condescending word he had spoken earlier now seemed to mock him, echoing back as proof of his own downfall. Lucien spoke again, softly but with unmistakable authority. "I hope tonight has been instructive, Mr. Sterling. There is power in wealth, yes, but wisdom and respect, those cannot be bought. Perhaps in time, you will learn that lesson." Harrison's lips tightened, a fleeting expression of anger and helplessness. But the room no longer responded to him. The social currency he had relied on, the fear and intimidation, had evaporated entirely. He had nothing left, no allies, no credibility, no dominance. Sarah, by contrast, was bathed in a quiet triumph. She didn't gloat. She didn't taunt. Her victory wasn't in loud words or public spectacle. It was in dignity, in composure, and in the recognition that integrity often carries far more weight than arrogance ever could. Harrison finally turned, shoulders heavy, and left the restaurant. Each step echoed through the hall like the final notes of a song no one wanted to hear again. The restaurant exhaled with him, the tension dissipating, leaving behind a palpable sense of justice. In the aftermath, the patrons returned to their meals, the staff resumed their work, and Sarah stood for a moment, catching her breath, her heart steady. The humiliation, the fear, the adrenaline, they were behind her now. She had survived, she had endured, and she had been vindicated in the most public, undeniable way possible. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about spectacle. It was about dignity, about standing tall when someone tried to diminish you. And tonight, Harrison Sterling had learned far too late that true power doesn't come from wealth, status, or cruelty. It comes from integrity, intelligence, and the quiet courage to face injustice without compromise. Sarah's eyes softened as she glanced toward Lucien. There was gratitude there, yes, but more importantly, there was recognition. Justice had been served, and it had come not through aggression or showmanship, but through calm, decisive authority. The villain had fallen, and the hero, quiet, brilliant, and unyielding, stood tall, ready for the next chapter. The tension in the restaurant finally lifted, but Sarah Bennett didn't move immediately. She stayed at her station, letting the quiet settle around her. The whispers of the patrons faded into the background, replaced by the steady hum of normal life returning. Her chest still rose and fell with adrenaline, but there was a new calm underneath it, one that came from knowing she had faced humiliation, deceit, and arrogance, and had come through unbroken. Lucien Valmont approached quietly, his presence unassuming yet undeniably commanding. He wasn't flashy, nor did he need to be. Every step he took radiated authority. Sarah noticed how his gaze lingered on her, not with pity, nor with patronizing approval, but with genuine recognition. "Sarah Bennett," he said, his voice calm but firm, "tonight you showed more than courage. You showed intelligence, patience, and dignity under fire. Not many people possess that combination." Sarah blinked, taken aback. Compliments had never come easily in her life, not in the past few years filled with exhaustion, endless shifts, and financial worry. She opened her mouth to respond but realized there were no words ready for what she felt. Instead, she simply nodded, letting the acknowledgement sink in. Lucien smiled faintly, as if understanding the limits of words. "I want to offer you a position," he continued. "A role where your talents, your intellect, your careful mind can finally be recognized, not hidden beneath a uniform or dismissed as mere service. I want you to lead a project that will change lives. Are you interested?" Her heart leaped. For a moment, she almost couldn't believe it. All those years spent studying, pushing herself academically, enduring every hardship, and now someone saw her, not as a waitress, not as someone invisible, but as the person she truly was. "Yes," she whispered, the word barely audible, yet powerful in its simplicity. She could feel a smile tugging at the corner of her lips, uncontainable now. Lucien's approval was subtle, a slight nod, but it carried more weight than any applause. "Good. Then let's get started. Your life is about to change in ways you've earned, not been given." Even with this new opportunity, Sarah's thoughts drifted briefly to her father. The man who had raised her, supported her dreams quietly, and never let her see the cracks in his own sacrifices. He deserved this too. She needed him to be well, to have the care that had seemed impossible until now. I can help with that as well, Lucian added, as if reading her mind. Medical care, housing, security, everything your father needs. You won't have to worry about survival anymore. Relief washed over Sarah, mingling with a gratitude so deep it almost choked her. Her father would finally be safe, cared for, and given the dignity he deserved. All the sleepless nights, the endless shifts, the worry, it had led her here, to this moment. And yet, even with the promise of wealth, opportunity, and security, Sarah felt something deeper. She had discovered something invaluable tonight, that her dignity, intellect, and perseverance were worth more than money, more than status, more than the approval of people like Harrison Sterling. She had been tested, and had emerged not just victorious, but unbroken. Lucian stepped back slightly, letting her absorb the reality. Harrison Sterling? He asked quietly, almost rhetorically. His world will adjust, yes. But that is not your concern. Your concern is your life, your work, and your father. Everything else will fall into place. Sarah exhaled slowly, the weight of tension she didn't even realize she had been carrying finally releasing. The restaurant, the confrontation, the humiliation, it all seemed distant now, like a storm that had passed. And in its place was a horizon full of possibility, respect, and opportunity she had always deserved. She glanced around, catching the eyes of her colleagues. Some were still shyly watching, hesitant to break the formality of the moment. Others smiled, subtle yet genuine. They had witnessed her strength and resilience, and in their acknowledgement, Sarah felt a quiet camaraderie that went beyond words. Her thoughts returned, as they always did, to her father. She pictured him finally relaxed, receiving the care he needed, finally free from the weight of worry. It was a vision that made her heart swell. This was the victory that truly mattered. Not the defeat of Harrison Sterling. Not the humiliation he had suffered. But this, the ability to provide, protect, and live with dignity and integrity. Lucian offered a small, knowing smile. Tonight was a turning point. But your story is just beginning. Don't let fear or doubt hold you back. You've already proven what you are capable of. Sarah nodded again, this time with confidence. She understood now that intelligence doesn't need permission to shine. It doesn't need validation from those who attempt to diminish it. It only needs the right moment, and, sometimes, the courage to stand still until that moment arrives. The restaurant resumed its rhythm, ordinary now, but with a memory embedded that none of its patrons would forget. And at the center of it all stood Sarah Bennett, calm, composed, and ready. Not just to work, not just to survive, but to thrive. To live a life that reflected every ounce of her effort, brilliance, and unwavering dignity. The lesson was clear, though unspoken. Wealth can be taken away, status can crumble, and arrogance can be exposed. But intellect, courage, and integrity, they endure. And those who wield them wisely, as Sarah now would, hold the truest power of all.